As we continue now, so the Biyam Narkecha continues to quote and explain the words of Rav Chaim Vital in the Otzros Chaim, that initially, V'lo hoya shum chalal v'shum avir panui, there was no void and there was no empty space. No empty air would be the literal translation, meaning that all that there was the infinite light. And there was no concept whatsoever of boundaries, which would take the infinite and turn it into the finite, or of any creations. When we say that there was no void or empty space, that's another way of saying that there was nothing that was devoid of any existence. Only a creation of God can have a void within it, because I'm veering off of what the Biyam Darkecha says into something really that's predicated upon the words of the Bala Sulam, but the Bala Sulam explains that because God has an infinite capacity to give, he created creations with an almost infinite capacity to receive. That capacity to receive, that's a void. So after creation took place, the concept of a void came into existence. But prior to that, there was nothing that was lacking. There was nothing that was wanting. Hence, there was no concept of a void whatsoever. In a footnote, he adds that even after creation, there really is nothing that is a void. Why? Because nothing is devoid of the infinite light. Because God permeates and really is the entirety of existence. And there is no place that doesn't have his light there. But as we're going to go on to explain in a number of different ways as we continue, that creation is permeated with God's light. However, it is hidden from the view of those who are within creation. That those of us within creation see creation as if it is devoid of God's light. And that's because the concept of tzimtzum that we'll talk about, of creating a boundary, was creating an illusion of us existing in a space that's devoid of God's light. And therefore, when Rav Chaim Vital writes that there was not yet a void, he means to say that there was not yet an existence which had as its defining feature the perception that it was devoid of God's light. There were also no vessels. There were no receptacles waiting to be filled. And that's why he says also that there was no empty space. And then he further points out that within creation, there are two fundamental points. First of all, creation is a place in which we do not directly see God's light, and it appears to be a place which exists in and of itself without the light of God bringing its existence into being. And secondly, creation is a place that requires a constant infusion of spiritual energy from God in order for its existence to continue. So when he says that prior to creation there was no chalal or avir panui, chalal means that there was no such thing as a place that was devoid. There was no place that was lacking in God's light, meaning, had you been there, so to speak, which would have been impossible, obviously, but had you been there, God's light would have been clear and obvious to everybody. And secondly, the avir panui means that there was nothing that was empty waiting to receive God's light. So the concept of Or Ha'ein Sof, the light of the infinite, that's another way of saying God's will, or you could say possibly God's desire to create creations. And when we're still at the point of this just being God's will, but so to speak, it hasn't happened yet. So we have not yet seen any tzimtzum, we have not yet experienced any contraction, nor has there yet been any action or any perceptual change that hides the existence of God. And therefore, the presence of creations has not yet been revealed, but everything was only the Or Ha'ein Sof, the infinite light. I also want to mention that in this last part, I mentioned concepts like God's will and then after God's will. Sometimes in Kabbalah, we discuss processes in a linear fashion when simply because for us to understand them, we have to hear about cause and effect, because that's how our minds work in this world. But the reality is that God's will is synonymous and simultaneous with it coming into existence. So it's really not a two-step process, but it's broken down that way in order for us to be able to understand it. Thank you very much for listening.